Hi everyone. My name is Courteney Ervin, and today we're going to talk about self-code. And self-code is a word that I made up, much like your Shakespeare. And it's exactly what it sounds like, right? Coding for yourself. Along those lines, this is a mildly interactive talk. So if you have a notebook, a phone that you would like to write some things down in, I will give you a moment to prepare for that, but also just emotionally prepare to do a little bit of work while I talk at you for the next 20, 25 minutes, okay? Are we all like mentally in that headspace? We're ready to interact? I don't see any nods at all. I was a teacher, I need to see. Great, awesome, thank you. Okay, great, so before we start talking about self-code and I tell you a little bit more about that, I want to start out by talking about a different concept, but a similar concept called self-love. And again, self-love is exactly what it sounds like, right? Loving yourself. And it comes out of a lot of social justice movements, and especially body positivity movements, where people make an active effort to love their own selves, including their strengths and their weaknesses. And I think that especially with open source code, where you have this sense of should, there's a lot of the sense that I should be writing open source code, I should be contributing to open source projects, I should be an amazing developer to do either of those things, right? That there's this intimidation, this feeling of obligation and intimidation that keeps you from participating. And so what I want to do is take this feeling of self-love and apply it to your code, right? Love your code, appreciate your code, and appreciate yourself as a developer, no matter what your strengths or weaknesses are, and feel like you are good enough, all right? So along the lines of self-love, I'm just going to take a moment and talk about myself. And I wrote this slide on a Thursday, so I'm not breaking any laws or anything. But right now, I'm a back-end developer at the New York Public Library, and I am working on an e-reading application that's open source that libraries can use to distribute e-books to their patrons. I also maintain an open source project called Code Montage, which we will talk about in a little bit. But 3.5 years ago, I knew 0 programming languages. I knew a little bit of markup, but 0 back-end programming languages. And now I'm a full-time back-end developer. And I can honestly say that I would never have made that switch if it hadn't been for my own personal contributions to open source code. And part of the reason, when I started doing open source code, I knew I had 8 hours of PHP under my belt. Nothing else. And so when I started writing Rails code as a very new developer, I didn't know anything about software development, and so I didn't know enough to be scared to write open source code. I didn't know enough I was naive. My ignorance protected me. And so I want to give you that sense of just complete ignorance. That's mostly my goal in life. So what I want to do first is make sure that you give yourself permission to write open source code. So I'd like you to do right now, we're actually actively going to make this choice, right? You're going to get out of this talk what you put into it. I want you to make eye contact with someone else in the room that you do not know. So people in the front, look back. People in the back, look forward. Make eye contact with someone that you do not know. I know it's scary, but you can do this, okay? All right, make eye contact. Let it be a little awkward. It's fine. It's fine. And I want you to mouth to that person. I want you to say to them, "You got this," and give them a little thumbs up. Little thumbs up, you got this. You just mouth it, you don't have to say it out loud. All right? Great. So now you have permission, you can do whatever you want, right? You're good. Talk over, I'm done. So now you have permission to write open source code, and I'm also going to give you permission to do it. This might be a little bit hard to read from a distance, but essentially these are kind of 2 ideas of open source. And the first one is that we are all working in a team. There's a lot of people. We're all deeply invested in this open source project, and we're going to work together and get shit done, right? All right, well, that's not really what open source looks like most of the time. Mostly it looks like this second image, alone in a room, late at night, lonely and cold, writing code and trying to do one more thing on this project that you feel strongly about. So as a maintainer of an open source project, I am very, very open to contributions from other people. And I think when you think about contributing to, say, Rails, that's a very different process. But there are a lot of smaller projects out there that are waiting for somebody to invest in them and to care about them. Okay, so you have permission from me and from some random stranger to write open source code. And I think when you get started with a more self-focused approach to open source, you really want to start by thinking about what your goal is. What do you want to get out of open source? So for the next little while, I'm going to go through some potential goals that you might have, and I want you to be mulling over in the back of your mind what your particular goal for open source code might be. Maybe you work at a company where your code is private. Many people do, and you can't share it. But you want to get a job one day in the future that is not at this company, and so you want to have some code that you can show people. Open source is great for that. Maybe there's a particular tool that you use and that you want to help out with, and you want to help support it and maintain it. Open source is perfect for that. Maybe there's a new technology you want to learn. Maybe you want to get into Neo4j. Maybe there's another tool that you want to learn, you want to work with, and you don't want to make yet another Twitter clone that no one uses. Just an idea, just putting that out there. Maybe don't waste your time on Twitter clones when you could contribute to a project that actually has people using it and is active. Maybe you don't have a side project right now and you want one, but you don't want to, again, make something that is just yours privately that's not really going to be used by others. You want to contribute that side project energy to something a little bit larger than yourself. Or maybe there's a problem that you really care about, that you want to solve, some technical problem, and you want to be a part of any kind of conversation around fixing that problem. Or perhaps there's a social cause that you care a lot about. As somebody who used to work in the nonprofit sector, there's a lot of nonprofits are awful with technology, and so having tools that help them is really, really beneficial, and they often can't afford it. Maybe it's something like what I'm going to call the Space Jam equation, which is that there's a team or a mentor or some developer out there that you really respect and you want to work with. The best way to get on their good side is to find their project, their open source project that they work on, or the team's open source project, and hop right in and be able to interact with those developers directly and get to know how they work and interact with them and show them your own code. Or maybe, and this was my goal when I started out with open source, you want a job. And you need to prove that you can do the job before you start the job. Okay, so those are some goals. How many people found their goal in that list? Raise your hand. Sweet, awesome. Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is with your phone, notebook, write down what your goal is. Write it down. Take a moment. I'm going to stand here and stare at you until you do something with your eyes that's not look at me. I'm just going to give you a couple minutes, not minutes, seconds. Okay, so now you have a goal. Maybe it's in your head, maybe it's on your phone, maybe it's in your notebook, right? But you have a goal for your open source work. So your open source goal may not be about code. You may want to revise your goal after we talk a little bit about this, but open source is not just writing code, and I'm sure many of you here are developers, but maybe you want to get outside of the bounds of writing code. Maybe you want to work on something a little bit different in your free time. You can think about contributing to open source and do it in a way that does not involve writing a single line of code. So one way is through outreach, and outreach can be as simple as clicking the star on GitHub in a repo that you like. It can be as complex as organizing a conference for a technology that you feel strongly about. It can be reaching out to stakeholders who are not developers but who are in a certain problem space and letting them know about the project. It can be doing a video tutorial on YouTube about how to use an open source project, right? None of these require actually writing code. Maybe you really like writing. I used to be an English major. I don't get to do that anymore. So maybe you want to write documentation that's actually readable and understandable and very clear. Maybe you see a typo on a project and you hate it, so fix it. Maybe you know a second language and you want to translate the project so that it can be used by more people. That's an amazing contribution that I, as someone who only speaks English, cannot possibly contribute to my own project. Maybe you're into design, or maybe you're really terrible at design, but you want to get better at it. Doing a design review, creating a logo, doing some UI analysis on an existing project, or QA, right? Getting started with QA. Write some tests. There's so many projects out there. They have so few tests. Please write tests. Give some seed data, right? Fill up a project with some seed data so that other people who develop on it have some practice data to work with. Write clear bug reports, or better yet, fix a bug report that hasn't really been clearly detailed and make sure that you can reproduce it and share the error content. Go change somebody's bug report or issue so that it's better and easier for other people to work with it. Code maintenance. So figure out how to deploy it and then write some documentation for that. Do code reviews on existing pull requests on an open source project. If you're experienced, maybe your goal is, hey, I want to be a lead software developer, and right now I'm not. I want to work with a team. I'm going to do 10 code reviews, and then I'll be able to show my employer that I'm good at this sort of work. Maybe you are trying to show that you could be a great software architect, but right now you're just a lead software developer. Cool. Go refactor something that looks hideous on GitHub, and you'll help both the open source project and be able to show that work that you've done and prove that you know how to do it. So there are lots of ways to contribute to open source. One more way is cash. Open source is for free. People work for free with open source. And I think that if maybe you're a CTO, maybe you work with a particular project and you like it a lot, but you don't have a lot of time to contribute to it, put money into the open source projects that you care about so that they can continue to exist. So these are lots of ways to contribute. Very few of them require writing code. And notice that I didn't say anything about writing new features or fixing existing issues. So think about what you want your contribution to be, looking at your goal, thinking about what your goal is, and give a second of thought to what your first contribution to open source will be. Is it going to be just starring a project on GitHub? Is it going to be tweeting about a project that you care about so other developers can find out about it? Is it going to be refactoring some really ugly project that you use but that is really buggy for you? Think about that. I'm going to give you a couple seconds. Just think about what you want your first contribution to be. Could be cash. Could be cash to me. I'll take it. It's OK. I'll do it. I'll sacrifice for us all. All right. So once you know how you want to contribute and what your goal is, then you want to start thinking about, OK, well, what's the project or the issue that I want to work on? So now we need to start our search. And how you search is going to depend on what your goal is, right? So if your top priority is a good community, right? This is going to be your first open source contribution. You've never done this before. You want a place where it's going to be really a warm welcome and you're not going to be mistreated. Well, talk to some other developers. This is a really great question if you're trying to network. Just like, oh, hey, what's an open source project that you really like or that you contribute to? Quick and easy. If you're looking for a particular technology or problem, GitHub is a really great way, has a few different search capacities that will help you find open source projects by that technology or by certain problems. OpenHatch is a website that allows you to find little bite-sized issues. So if you just have like maybe you have a couple hours and you're just like, I just want to do something really fast and get it over with, that's fine. For a cause, so Code Montage is the project that I mentioned before. It's a project that I maintain, and we list open source projects based on their social good commitment. So if you like education, you want to do something about education, you would look on Code Montage under education. Maybe it's poverty alleviation, et cetera, et cetera. In December, there's a project called 24 Pull Requests, which is really great, and you do a pull request every day for 24 days during the holidays. And then Code Triage lists GitHub projects based on how messed up they are, essentially, how many issues they have. So if you're in it for the hero worship, Code Triage might be a good place to start. OK. And you want to make sure, especially if this is your first time, that you are going to get a warm welcome. So these are some labels on GitHub issues that are good for beginners. You should also look around before you commit to a project to find out what their community is like, which may mean looking at their pull requests and seeing like what their comments are like on pull requests. Are they nice to people who contribute to them? You should look for a Slack channel or an IRC chat or an email address, anything that you can reach out to if you need help or if you get caught up in something and you're not able to solve the problem. You should also look for recent activity. This is something people don't mention a lot, but before you commit to a project, I don't care how much you like it, make sure that somebody's actually working on it. Look at when their last commit was. This is a really good way to just make sure that you're not wasting your time if it's really important to you to have your pull request merged in, which it might not be, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. And then once you find an issue that you care about and that you want to work on, call dibs on it. Because there's nothing more frustrating than taking some time and working on an issue and fixing it, and then finding out somebody else has already fixed it and made the pull request. So put a comment or comment in the community that you find and say, hey, I'm going to be working on this one. Is anyone else doing this right now? I'm going to work on it. Also, just because someone else called dibs, if it's been a while and they haven't made a pull request yet, it might be worth it to pick that back up, right? Maybe they haven't finished. And before you commit to the project, it's really important to make sure that you find a community that you like, because the worst part of a project is setting up the installation process. Installation is can be really hard. And it's really hard because the person who created the project already has what they need on their computer. They're set. They got it working on Mac, OS X, version 10.7 with their particular version of Python or whatever. So they have it working, and when you start to install it, all of a sudden it's like not working for you. It's awful. It's terrible. There are errors popping up that you didn't expect. The documentation is awful. And I think that this can be the step where people are like, nah, this is not for me. I just don't know enough, and I'm ready to just walk away from open source forever. Don't do that, okay? Installation, more like Zenstallation. So installation is can be your first pull request, right? If it's terrible, if it's awful, if you don't enjoy it, if some error comes up that you're not able to solve, that's your first issue. Put that thing in GitHub, copy and paste the error in and say, hey, this doesn't work for that. If you're able to solve it, that's your first pull request, right? Update the documentation. Tell people how to make it work on a Windows machine as opposed to a Mac. Okay, so that installation process can be really helpful, because as a maintainer who already has it working on my machine, this is something I can't really test for unless I commit a lot of time to it. So you can help that person get more contributors by making it actually installable. So that could be your first pull request for a project you care about. All right, so now we're going to get into the code process as opposed to the overarching beneficial things. But once you choose your project, just make sure that you're paying attention to working for yourself, right? Making it work for you. If you're passionate about the project that you choose, then making the installation work is a contribution to that project. It's okay. The code process. If you're going to be writing code, if that's what you choose to do to contribute to your open source project, the first things that you want to do are read the README and read the contributing.md file, which often have information about how to contribute to open source code. You're going to want to make sure that you check in regularly with the community, particularly before you add a really big library or make any huge changes. Check in first, don't waste your time. And then the last thing is to do the work. So in addition to checking in, you also want to make sure that you are putting your best foot forward and not wasting the time of the maintainer if it's something that you could quickly Google and find yourself. Or if they don't know the answer to it, then investigate it yourself. And then this is the Git process. There's no way I'm going to be able to explain Git in the next 7 minutes. But essentially, the process is a little bit different when you're working on a project that doesn't belong to you. You don't get to just push code into it, hopefully. Not at first, right? So on GitHub, you'll fork, and at the end, you'll create a pull request. But in between, these are kind of the 6 Git commands that you'll want to follow in approximately this order. So you'll clone it, you'll create a remote for the main project, you'll create a branch for the work that you're going to do, you'll write commits. This is pretty familiar if you've worked with Git at all. Then you'll make sure that it's up to date, and you'll push it up and create a pull request. I'm not going to get into the details of this, but these are the 6 that you can look up. Like I said, do the work that you can look up and understand if you haven't worked with Git or GitHub before. And then we'll get to the actual pull request. So make sure that your pull request is small and focused. If you make a bunch of white space changes that are great, but then you also add a library in the same pull request, and I don't want the library, I just want the white space changes, I can't merge your pull request. So make sure that you're really doing very specific, focused work that you say that you're going to do, and make those pull requests small. And then just be clear that you're open to feedback in the pull request message that you create. So just saying, hey, I'm really open to making any changes that you want, just let me know. Because as a maintainer, I want you to come back to the project, and I don't want to give you feedback that's too harsh if you're not open to it. I would rather just say, hey, we can't really merge this right now, than give you line-by-line feedback if you don't necessarily seem open to it, because my main concern, and this may not be true of all maintainers, but my main concern is that you enjoy your experience with the project and that you maybe come back and write more code for it so that I don't have to be alone in my room late at night hoping and wishing and feeling lonely. And the last thing is be yourself. This often means use emojis, but with all things in life, relationships are really important, and the person on the other end of that pull request is a person, right? And we may want to make sure that we have a good relationship with them so that we can continue to network with them and keep them in our professional life. And that goes along with the follow-up, right? So once you make the pull request, whether it gets merged or not, that's work that you've done that you can use. So particularly along the lines of like finding a job, you can write a blog post about the work that you did. You can put it in your resume. You can share it in an interview. That pull request becomes work that shows that you know how to work consistently and clearly and solve particular problems. You can use the relationship that you have with the maintainer of the project and use it as a networking tool. You can possibly use them as a reference if you contribute to the project a lot. If you're very invested in it, you may become a co-maintainer, right? It depends on, again, what your goal is, but think about the pull request as an act in and of itself. Don't think about like it being merged in as the most important part of the open source process. So just a quick note for anyone who maintains an open source project, everything that I've said so far goes both ways. So you can flip it to your advantage, right? Make sure that you have a kind community that people can come to when they need help. Make sure that you are very clear about what kind of help that you need. So for example, with our e-reading application, we're going to need people to fix the metadata sometimes about books. It's really hard to get a computer program to understand that Bell Hook's name should always be lowercase and there should never be uppercase letters in it, right? So there are things that only a human being can figure out, and there are going to be times when we need librarians to spend their time fixing our metadata. That's going to be a certain contribution that we need. And we may not want code contributions, but that's how we can be best helped. Make that really clear if you maintain an open source project. How can you best be helped? What do you need the most? It doesn't have to be code. You also want to make sure your installation documentation is clear. Don't turn anybody into that panda that we saw earlier. It's not necessary. And finally, say thank you to people. And thank you could be the text in response to their pull requests. It can be a tweet out from your project. A thank you can be introducing them to somebody that is in your network that you think that they would work well with. It can be sending them a job that comes across your desk if you think that they work well, right? There are lots of ways to say thank you, but do say thank you because nobody has to write code for free. And along those lines, for both maintainers and developers alike, I think that the last thing that you should take away is that open source is not a requirement. You do not have to work for free if you don't want to. If you weren't able to come up with a goal for that kind of work from this talk, then don't write open source code. It's fine. It's okay to say no if it doesn't work for your life right now. I think there is a large feeling of like obligation, like you have to do this. If you're a good developer, this is something that you do. And it can be really beneficial to the community, but if it's not beneficial to you, don't do it. Just don't. If it makes you feel bad, don't do it. Quick tip about life, okay? So that's it. Thanks very much for listening. I hope you write some open source code if you want to, and I hope if you don't, you sleep. That sounds like a good idea, all right? Have a good day.